Shall we get my next guest on then? Well, yesterday afternoon, the leader of the opposition party, the leader of the Labour opposition party in Britain, Ed Miliband, has said that if he gets into power in 2015, he's going to attack the bankers, he's going to downsize big banks, he's going to make banking more competitive, he's going to roll up his sleeve and he's going to get really stuck into bankers' bonuses. Joining me on the line to discuss this and much more is economist and wealth manager Jonathan Davis. Jonathan, welcome to the programme.
Thank you, Richie. Love to speak to you.
Good to talk to you, and Happy New Year to you. Is it too late to say Happy New Year? I always ask that. No, I've just done it.
It depends what part of the world you're in.
So tell me this then. Big Bad Ed is going to go after the banks in 2015. What do you think?
No, he's not.
In a word.
Bearing in mind that he was a minister in the government that in 2008 and 2009 gave the banks £1,000 billion of my children's future. Ultimately, this is not a left and right thing, Richie. This is a them against us. It's the politicians of all colours. It's the bankers, the central banks, the media, the mainstream media, and multinational corporations against everyone else. Here we are, we're all trying to make a living and get by in a fair and moral society. Unfortunately, we're being hampered all the way. There's no way on earth that should Labour get into government in 2015, that they're going to go after the bankers, because they're the guys who made the bankers the fortunes that they've got from 1997 to 2010. So nothing's going to change there.
Now, he was a minister in the Labour government at the time, but they would say, Jonathan, that they did the best with what they had, that recapitalising the banks was the right thing to do, and that they couldn't tell, this is them saying, this is not me saying it now,
sure,
that they couldn't tell that not only would the banks not start to capitalise small businesses, but they would continue to give themselves these massive bonuses. I believe Goldman Sachs outlined last week something £4 billion in bonuses. £4 billion. Ed Miliband would say, look, we couldn't foresee the banks doing that.
And yet the banks have done it since time immemorial. So, of course, you're right. Labour are saying that they couldn't see this and they couldn't see that. They couldn't see much, could they? I remember Gordon Brown, that great socialist of our time, saying in the summer of 2007 that he'd abolished boom and bust. And it's a funny thing, but I think 2 or maybe 3 months later, we had Northern Rock. We had queues round the block because the system was breaking apart.
I remember it well, yeah.
It's total arrant nonsense that they couldn't see. They saw what they wanted to see. And what they wanted to see was more and more debt in society, more and more people, more and more businesses borrowing sensational, fantastic amounts of money. And, excuse me, who makes the money out of lending? The banks do. And as I say, this is not an anti-Labour thing, because when in effect the Tories got in 2010, a coalition, but in effect the Tories, what happened? This was just after the biggest crash in history, of course. Households and businesses, in effect, stopped borrowing because the banks, in effect, stopped lending
wouldn't
to
give
them.
Any money, yes.
So in order to keep the economy going and pretending that everything's okay, the government stepped up to the plate and is now borrowing over £100 billion a year. So in the decade before 2010, it was households and businesses that was doing all the borrowing. Now it's the government. Ultimately, borrowing is yet again going through the stratosphere. Who ultimately are the beneficiaries of that? The bankers.
And you and I have spoken before, and you know what, we've spoken to each other many times over the years. I love having you on. I agree with most of what you have to say, but that's pretty good, isn't it, in this day and age? I'm amazed that you still get invited onto national media here in Britain because of what you're saying. And we've spoken over the years. One of the central issues here, you just talked about the £100 billion worth of borrowing. I've argued, and I'm going to talk to you in a minute a little bit about Iceland, just a little bit about them. I've argued that what in the name of God are sovereign nations doing, borrowing money from central banks? Why not issue their own currency? Why not, Jonathan? Nobody's an answer for me.
Because it's the expedient thing to do. Let me give you a little bit of history here. I appreciate time is not necessarily freely available, but about 100 years ago in the United States, just after the First World War, manufacturers, great big corporations, stepped up their manufacturing capacity because they saw all these guys coming back from Europe. They thought demand was going to go through the roof. Instead, demand didn't. There was a massive oversupply of goods for sale. They didn't sell, prices collapsed, businesses were about to go bankrupt left, right and centre, big corporations. Now, in a similar vein to 2008, the president of the US could have taken out massive borrowings and bailed out these businesses, and the Federal Reserve could have slashed interest rates. What actually happened, and this is very pertinent to what your question is, what actually happened was President Warren G. Harding brought in a thing called capitalism. He let the corporations go bust. He balanced the budget, no big deficits, and the Fed hiked interest rates. Within 18 months of 1920, they were back to full employment after having been at nearly 25% unemployment, and then we had the roaring 20s. So you're asking me, why are these governments borrowing vastly, in this case from the European Central Bank? Because it's politically expedient, because they have been told by their advisors that if they let the thing collapse, then there'll be anarchy, the tanks will go on the streets, there'll be riots everywhere. Do you know what? In 1920, there was none of that. What happened was the businesses went busts, the costs of goods and services collapsed, and those who had some savings, they actually made more money because the rates went up, the cost of living collapsed, and they could actually get the economy going again. Instead, countries all around the world, the UK, the US, all over Europe, of course, Japan, China, all they're doing is borrowing vastly and pretending that everything is okay. Instead, what that does is keep the elite in business, in other words, the politicians, the bankers, the central banking system, and it keeps everyone else with a higher cost of living, and unemployment is soaring right across America and right across most of the EU. That is no solution. It's a great problem of our time. It's a travesty, unfortunately, until we get rid of Marxists out of running countries, we'll never have a solution to the problem.
Jonathan, you don't do conspiracy theories, and I'm supposed to bring people on here to argue with them. But look, I'm a layman. I know very little about international finance, but I do know that the European Union persuaded countries like Ireland, Greece, Spain, Portugal, Italy for years and years and years to take vast amounts of money that those countries didn't really need for building projects and infrastructure projects in those countries. They then come back to them and say, right, you can't pay us back those loans that you borrowed from us. Therefore, we're going to have your state resources now. We're going to force an austerity program on the people of those countries. And this is what it is. And people like my colleague here at the People's Voice, David Icke, people like Jim Marrs in America, were saying this for years and years and years, that this was pre-planned. It was preordained. And I can't find an argument against that, Jonathan.
Yeah. Well, first of all, we'd have to see evidence of that. Otherwise, it's just a conjecture and assumption. The reason why I shook my head... I beg pardon?
Sorry to interrupt you. I don't like interrupting you, but there's evidence. To me, it's a self-evident thing now.
No, it's not, and I'll tell you why. The reason why I shook my head while you were making your statement was you said that the EU made the governments of Ireland, etc., borrow all that money. Nothing, in my view, could be further from the truth.
Corrupted, those governments then, not made.
Yeah, no, hold on. When in 1999, the 31st of December, the Irish interest rate, the base rate was 6%. On the 1st of January 2000, it was 3%. The Irish politicians desperately wanted that lower interest rate. And sure enough, for the next 10 years, it created one of the biggest housing bubbles and economic booms in the history of the planet. It was the Celtic tiger. Prior to that, all we heard about was the Asian tigers. Ireland, of course, became the Celtic tiger. And the elite, again, the politicians, the bankers, the corporations, the property developers, they all made vast fortunes individually and corporately, or in a group. Now, you can say that that's a conspiracy of a one world order, the Bilderberg Group, or whoever it may be. I'm not disputing it. I just don't have sufficient evidence.
Concrete
what
evidence,
I have evidence of is a lot of people individually, A, got vast power, and or B, got vast fortunes. To me, that's just greed and milking the system. Now, I don't know whether or not it's a big picture thing, but I certainly know that's what happened in Ireland and Greece and Spain and Portugal and Cyprus and so on.
Spot on. Now, the International New York Times report yesterday, Nathaniel Popper is the journalist, and they talk about, he says, I'm going to read a little bit of what he says to you, and we'll chat about it then. Iceland is a living experiment in what can happen when a country forces its financial firms to go under, rather than bailing them out as much of the rest of the world did during the global financial crisis. In 2008, all three of Iceland's major banks collapsed. None failed more spectacularly than Kaupthing, I hope I pronounced that right, the bank whose glass headquarters were on the waterfront. At one point, it had a balance sheet 4 times as large as the annual economic output of the country. Last month, 4 former executives of that bank were sentenced to multiple-year prison terms. Its unusual path, Iceland, has been held up as a successful model of what can happen when a country opts to let its financial firms go under. Jonathan, that's in the New York Times today. However, critics of that say it's easy to talk about Iceland because it's such a small country with such a small population. What's your take on it?
My take is that wherever we have capitalism, we have more equality and less fraud. My example, I go back to, I won't go into details again, is America, hardly a small country, 1920 to 1921. Unfortunately, we have capitalism practically nowhere. Practically everywhere is varying degrees of Marxism. Now, the bulk of your viewers and the people who work at People's Voice will disagree with me vehemently when I say to you that even the current UK government is on the Marxist scale. And I know I'm sounding crazy now, but let me explain what I mean. Marxism is about bailing out, for one thing, is about bailing out failed businesses, which are of no benefit to society. Bailing out the banks, bailing out the bankers, week after week, day after day, year after year, is not capitalism. It's obviously Marxism. Unfortunately, it's Marxism for the rich, and it also keeps the thing afloat, to which you'd say, well, surely that's a good thing. Well, in the short term, yes, of course it is. But in the long term, we become like Greece, etc. Greece, where 60% of the youngsters are unemployed, where the unemployment rate is 30%, where people are losing everything and they're even losing their freedoms. Because in some of these countries, they're saying that if you rise up against the government, we'll send the tanks in and you will be thrown in jail. That is not liberty. That is not capitalism. But where you have capitalism, you have more freedom, more liberties, and more equality.
Yeah, I agree with that, as long as it's capitalism with oversight. You know,
Agreed.
yeah, we had this the last time we were on. Jonathan, that's about all we have time for. I love chatting to you. Thanks for taking the call today. And no doubt again we'll be talking in the foreseeable future. Thanks for taking the call. Jonathan
Great
Davis,
pleasure. All the best.
thanks a lot. Economist and wealth manager talking to us here on The People's Voice.